If you're interested in using Contentful CMS to power a headless website, the one feature that you have to implement is their brand new live preview capability. Now, live preview is going to make it much easier for content editors to build websites. However, if I'm honest, as a developer, it's probably not the easiest feature in the world to implement, and it took me a good couple of days to get my head around everything. Now, to prevent you from going through the same pains as I had to, I thought I would create this deep dive video, and in it, I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know, all the different headed gotchas, and basically a bunch of stuff so you didn't have to go through the same debugging hell as I did. So if that sounds good to you, carry on watching to get to content editing heaven. Now, before we start looking at the code, there's a few points that we need to clarify, because if I'm honest, it took me several hours to set up all this preview nonsense, and there's a few little things that if I'd understood at the beginning, it would have saved me hours from banging my head against the wall. Now, before we start talking about those caveats, let's quickly clarify what preview actually means within this new Contentful feature. Right, so I've jumped us over to the Contentful preview, and there's two features that we need to talk about. Now, the first one is real-time content update. So within the CMS here, you can see we've got this title property, and this is going to map to this property on page right here. And the great thing is that once this is enabled, you can see that when I'm typing, the content is going to get updated in real time. So content editors will be able to have a good idea of what the page looks like while they're editing it. Now, the second feature, hope you can see here, is the ability to do the inspector. And basically what happens is that once you click on this big edit button, you can see that in the left-hand side, the CMS is automatically going to highlight the property that an editor clicks on. So this is just going to make it a little bit easier for people to work with content within preview. Now, being realsies with you here, if you want to set up preview having both of those features for the entirety of your website, expect to invest a lot of time and effort. Now, the reason for this is that it's not just a simple case of turning a feature on and it magically works. So for example, that inspect property where you have that little blue edit button, basically to get that working on your site, every single time that you render a property from Contentful, you're going to have to add some code within your website. Now, on top of this, you're also going to have to maintain that code in the future. So if anyone ever added a new property or renamed an existing property, then you're going to have to do a code release as well. And this is the reason why my first tip is to really consider the benefit of the inspect element compared to the amount of total effort it's going to take you to implement it. Now, a second thing that really caught me out when I tried to implement this for the first time was around actually getting the content to update in real time. Now, in order to set this up, under the hood, you're going to be using the Contentful Preview API. However, from my testing, this only really seems to work well with GraphQL. Now, I've got a demo site which you can access from the description below, but whenever I've tried to access the content via REST, the real-time content update didn't really work. Now, I've also downloaded and installed all the sample sites created by Contentful over at their GitHub. Again, you can find the link below, and I found the same thing here. So my advice is that if you're watching this and your website is using the JavaScript SDK and using REST to talk to Contentful, then I'd recommend that you switch to using GraphQL first and then think about implementing preview second, because that's going to save you a bunch of time and it's going to lead to much cleaner code within your code base. Well, that covered how to get data and the considerations, and my final tip for this section is around hosting. Now, when setting everything up, it is possible to feed your Contentful CMS instance to your production website, and then using the access tokens, you can toggle between pod content and preview content all from one website. Now, I personally don't like this setup. When I'm implementing a headless website for a customer, typically what I'll do is create my production website, as you'd expect, but then I'd create a preview specific website. And this website, its only job is to be used by Contentful and editors for preview. Now, I'll be the first to admit this definitely isn't an essential step that you have to adhere to. However, from my experience, this will make your life a little bit easier when setting everything up. Right, so just like any project, in order to get a headless website to talk to a headless CMS, we need a bunch of keys. So we can get our keys in Contentful by going to settings. Within settings, we can scroll down to this API keys, which is hidden by my big head. But once we click on this, you can see we can generate an API key, and I won't show you my ones, but once we get down here, you can see that we've got a space ID. We're going to need this. We've got a content preview API access token. You're going to need this within your websites. You're probably going to need this access token thing. And you also need to know the environment that you're working on, which is probably going to be master. Sweet. So after you've generated those tokens, the next step is to jump over to your app, make sure you've got a .m file, and you can add in your space ID and your preview access tokens and all that kind of stuff. Now, another environment variable that you need to set up is this Contentful preview secret. And you can see here that I've set my value as secret. However, this can be any value that you want. I'd probably put a GUID in here if I was doing something in production, basically something which isn't easy to guess. Now, the purpose of this variable here is a way to validate that when we're doing our preview, that it's your headless website making a request and not some naughty person on the internet. So again, this is key and we'll cover it later, but make sure you have all these different things. Again, you can make sure you've got your Contentful environment set to master. You can also make sure you've got your host, which is preview.contentful.com here as well. Now, before I touch on the Contentful specific setup steps, it's probably worth mentioning that this demo website that we're looking at, it's been built using a Next.js and it's on version 14. And for the eagle-eyed who know about Next.js, you'll see that I'm using the new app router stuff and server-side components. Now, it's definitely worth pointing out that you can use any framework with Contentful. So it could be React, you could be using SSR, SSG, Vue, Angular, whatever. And the steps you need to follow, they're loosely going to look exactly the same as the steps I'm showing you here. Now, the only real difference with the server component stuff that I'm showing you here is that one, we're building stuff in this app folder, and two, I'm going to be making use of things like generate static params rather than like get static props, etc., etc. Now, that covered the makeup of the website. And the other thing to probably point out now is the data that we're going to be returning. Now, the data that we're going to be returning is going to be this post content type here. And it's probably worth pointing out that if you want to return different types of data, then you're going to have to map this in the preview, and I'll show you that in a minute. However, you're going to have to write separate code for every single content type that you want to work with preview. Now, just for this particular content type, if we look at it, you can see it's got a few fields here. So we've got things like a title, which is a short text, a summary, which is long text. We've got some images and some dates, rada. And if I look within my content tab here, filter it by post, you can see that we've got 3 different content types already set up. So this is the information that we're going to be pulling back for today's demo. Cool, so we're ready to start building stuff. And the first thing we need to do is create an API. Now, in order to get our live content to work, what we need to do is that whenever we make a change within Contentful, we need the CMS to be able to send a request down to our website to automatically refresh the page. And this is done by creating a preview API within our headless website. Now, in order to hopefully make this as easy as possible to understand, let's quickly look at the Contentful part first. So in order to set up this API request, if we go to settings, you can go to this content preview. And then within content preview, you can click on this button and set up a brand new setting. Now, what will happen here is you'll give your preview a name and then you'll need to map a content type. So if I go back to the one that I've created, you can see that I'm mapping my post content type and it's going to set up a request to this URL here. So for this example, I'm using my local dev site. You can see that in that dev site, I'm going to be making requests to API, and then I've got an endpoint called enable draft post. Then as parameters, I need to pass in secret, and I'm passing in this value secret. And remember, I set this up within my environment variable earlier. Remember, I pointed out that secret thing. Well, this is the value that you set there. And then finally, we do slug equals entry fields slug. And this is all we need to make that request. So with that content set up, what's going to happen is that whenever anyone does the preview, that post type in the CMS, when they start typing, a request is going to be made back to your headless website. That's going to refresh the page in real time when changes occur. And that's how we're going to see our updated content on a page without you having to do anything else. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is that you're going to have to create an API for every single different type of content that you want to set up with your preview. So you might have to create a lot of these APIs. And this is the reason why within my app API folder, you can see I've got this folder called enable draft post. Obviously, I could have called this wherever I wanted to. We just need to make sure this maps to the API request that you set within that content preview. And then within here, I've got a file called root.js. Now, if I look within root.js, you can see there's a few things going on. So first, I'm pulling in information. I'm doing this from a custom API I created, and this is called GraphQL SDK. So this is something I've created, and this is going to call Contentful, and it's going to get information about my post type. Now, underneath here, you can see that I'm using Next headers, and there's this useful thing called draft mode. Now, if you're doing headless CMS development with Next.js, draft mode is going to allow you to figure out if you're in preview mode or not. So this is really handy, and you'll be using this extensively throughout this demo. And then underneath here, you can see that what I'm doing is getting this request. We're guessing in the search params that we just passed in. And hopefully remember, we passed in that secret, and then we also passed in the page slug. Now, the first thing we're doing here is throwing an error. If we don't have the secret or the slug, our preview's not going to work, and we're going to see a 400 error. If we do have a secret, however, it's not mapped to the secret that we've set within our environment variable, then we're going to throw an error invalid token. So this is how we can authorize that only people who can use this API are using it. Then after this, I'm getting the slug. I'm then querying Contentful itself to make sure that the request being requested actually exists within the CMS. If that page does exist, we're then going to do this bottom bit. So we're saying that preview mode is enabled. Then there's a hack at the moment that we need to add in. So this thing here is basically only being added because there's an issue with Next.js around this pre-render bypass not being set properly. So at the moment, you need to add this in, otherwise your preview won't work as expected, but this is a temporary hack. And then after that, the final thing we need to do is a redirect. And in this redirect, I'm now going to redirect the preview request to the page on my website that this slug maps to. So hopefully that all made perfect sense, but if not, let's just quickly go through it one last time. So when an editor is setting up a page, at some point in the process, they're going to have to define a page URL. Now, in order to get the right page to display from our website in this panel, what we're going to have to do is take the URL, which is often known as a slug. We're going to pass it down to an API endpoint within our headless website. That endpoint is going to do some validation, but ultimately it's going to do a redirect and load the correct page. And this is how we can render the correct page whenever we just jump to it within the CMS. Simple. So the next set of tasks are going to be enabling preview on a per page basis. And in order to do this, you're going to have to make use of the live preview SDK provided by Contentful. So in order to install this package, you can head over to npm or use the package manager of your choice and do an npm I, and it's at contentful/live/preview. Now, after successfully installing that package, you should get access to a bunch of different functions and higher order components that allow you to set up your preview. Now, one caveat that I did notice when I was trying to set this up is that depending on the application you're using, sometimes the default mode doesn't work. So we're looking at the live preview documentation on the Contentful website, and you can see the recommended way of setting up the preview provider is to use this higher order component. I'm going to wrap our app around it, and we're going to do some settings, and we'll cover that in a minute. However, when I was doing some sort of setup, I think it was for a normal page server-side rendered component, this didn't work and I got an error. So if you do encounter an error and it's around the Contentful live preview provider component, then if you jump to the GitHub docs over at live preview, you can see that the provider also has this Contentful live preview function instead. And from here, you can actually do this init method, pass in this options object and set everything up this way instead. So just keep in mind, if this doesn't work for you, then my recommendation is to try this approach instead. Okay, so now the next thing to look at is the actual parameters that we need to pass into this preview provider. So the first thing that you'll need to supply is the locale. And in my example, you can see I'm passing in en-us. Now, the reason I'm doing this is en-us is the default locale within Contentful. So this is the value that most people need to provide. And if you change locale, obviously you're going to have to put in the value you changed it to, but use this if you're using the default stuff. Now, the next thing you'll need to decide on is if you want to do the live preview mode. So basically in that preview, when you type, if you want all the content to update in real time, if you want that, you're going to have to enable this enable live updates param. And in it, you need to pass in this is enabled, true or false, is preview mode. And remember, we can get if we're in preview mode or not. If we're using Next.js, using this draft mode from Next headers, all we need to do is say is enabled from draft mode, and off we go. Now, if you decide you want to do the inspector, so when that little blue box which says edit comes on in the preview, so we jump on it, we jump to different params. If you want that to work, you're going to have to enable this inspector mode, again, just passing in that draft mode. And finally, when you're setting things up, if you want a bunch of information getting logged to the console, then just set debug mode equals true, and you're going to see a bunch of stuff here. Now, I'm not going to lie to you and say I set everything up and I didn't have any errors at all. This took me a few hours to get everything working. Now, if you're setting this up and you do encounter issues, one tip I would give you is that if you go into the preview, you can see there's this little green ticket. Now, if you click on this, you can actually see if you have inspector mode and live updates enabled correctly. You can see here, I've got a green tick. And if you haven't got things set up, if your config's wrong, you're going to get an error. Now, the other thing which is probably worth mentioning is that if I actually delete these provider here, save it, and then refresh the page, Contentful will give you the correct error message. So you can see here, live updates are not initialized. Please call Contentful live preview in it. Now, when I was setting it up, my layout wasn't being called correctly. So when I saw this, at least it gave me an indication that my layout wasn't being called. So again, you do get some tips. However, do expect some debugging hell here. Now, the next step is obviously to update Next.js and create a page which will render out our post content type. Now, because this video is just focused on preview, I'm not going to deep dive into the code to get Contentful to talk to Next.js. Now, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, I have created a video. Look in the description to find that video. Now, as a quick overview, within my Next.js app, you can see within my app folder, I've created a page and it's called post graph page. And this is going to be part of the URL. To make it a dynamic routing compatible, you can see we've got this little square bracket, and a folder called slug. And then within slug, we've got this page.js. Now, within this page.js, there's nothing specific around preview yet. I'll get to that in a second, but just to give you a quick overview. So within generate static params, I'm going to query Contentful for information about every single post content type. This is then going to give us the slugs. Now, what's going to happen is this is going to iterate in a loop for each slug we create. And then for each slug, we're then going to eventually call this post graph page, and the slug is going to get passed in here. Now, within our method here, you can see that all I'm doing is taking the slug. I'm then re-querying Contentful, and here I'm going to get information about this specific page. This is going to get added into an object. And then for this example, I'm passing this object into a component called post. Now, obviously you can set up your Next.js however you want to, but the key thing here is that basically you're going to end up with a page object that's going to get passed into a page or component. And this is the object that we need to do our preview stuff on. Right, so I've jumped us over to that post component, and the first preview specific thing that we need to do on this page is import two hooks. So the hooks we need to import are use Contentful live updates and the use Contentful inspector mode. And you can get both of these from the @contentful/live-preview/react. Okay, so the first page related thing that we need to do is create some sort of mechanism that gives us access to this live content. Because you can see here, as I'm typing, we'll need a way in our headless website to get this content in real time. And this is very different to how we normally access page data, because normally I'd either save the page or publish it and then get the end published data from the SDK. So in order to get that live content, we need to use the use Contentful live updates hook. So what you'll do is pass in the object you got from Contentful. This is going to return you a version which has the live content rather than the saved or published version. and then we can use this to render our properties. So you can see we've got this live post here, and if I go to my page, you can see I'm rendering out my content properties, doing live post.title and a live post.summary. Remember, this maps to that post content type and the fields I've defined there. Now, the second preview related feature that you might want to hook up on a per page basis is this inspector mode. And what we need to do is get away of passing in the property ID here, passing it back to Contentful, so we can make sure that once we click on edit, that the right field in Contentful will get updated. And we do this using that second hook. So in order to get this up and running, we're going to use that second hook that we set up earlier called use Contentful inspector mode. And the first thing we need to do on our page is map this function to the specific bit of content in Contentful that we want to update. And we do that using entry ID. So this is going to be a GUID, which you can find in Contentful. And you can see here that we've got a map. And now this is going to work on a page level. So doing this is going to give us access to this function, which is called inspect props. Now, the next thing you're going to have to do is for every single property that you're rendering out from Contentful. So you can see here, we've got my title. You can see here summary. You're going to have to wrap the decorating HTML using this call. So hopefully you can see that, wrapping every single content type and every single property you want to render with this bit of code is going to take a lot of maintenance. And if anyone ever adds a new property or they change the field ID, then things might break in your code. So just something to be aware of. Now, just in terms of implementation, in order to get that edit button working, you're going to have to do this deconstruction. We're going to use our inspect props, and then we're going to pass in this property called field ID. And then this is where we can do the mapping to the property ID that we want to associate it with. And this, you can see summary, and excerpt here. And this is how we do that two-way mapping. And after we've done that, once we go back into Contentful, this little feature here is going to work, and we can zoom around inside the CMS by just clicking on properties. And that, my friends, is pretty much everything you need to do in order to get up and running with this new live preview with Contentful. And I'm hoping this video is going to make it much easier for you to set everything up, because it did take me a few days. Now, if you do enjoy Contentful and you want to learn more about it, then I have written a book which is linked to in the description below. And this book covers everything you need to do in order to get set up and running with a headless website using React and Next.js with Contentful. Now, aside from that, if you haven't already, do not forget to click on like if you've got value from this video, and smash on subscribe. Now, my name is John, and I release a video every single Sunday aimed at making people better developers, so you don't want to miss out on that. Now, the final thing I've got to say is that if you want to learn a little bit more about Contentful, then I have created a deep dive video into their SDKs. So the link to that video is on screen now. Watch it to learn a lot more. Otherwise, until next Sunday, happy coding.